The idea of walking through history is to encourage people to go out in their own area really and have a look at the landscape that surrounds them in a totally different way. The main idea really is that people enjoy themselves. We take account of weather, we have superb food, we stop for a very nice lunch out on the hill. It's done at a leisurely pace, as with all walks, is done at the pace of the slowest, which in most cases is me. Everything that we see in the landscape, even though today it may look barren and neglected and deserted, at one time it had a hugely important purpose. Just behind me you can see one of the most significant Iron Age forts that exist in Wales. It belonged to the Silures, a tribe of Iron Age folk who lived in this area prior to the arrival of the Romans. And they had settlements throughout these little valleys, and they have field systems which still exist today. We can see the banks and the ditches that they built. This particular part of the Radnor Hills, this particular part of Wales, we've got relics that relate to the Neolithic period, to the Bronze Age period, the Iron Age, the Roman, the early medieval, etc., etc. Today, when we think of the hills of Wales, we think of sheep. But really, up until the 19th century, sheep were irrelevant, and the prime livestock animal was cattle. And this area that we're in was one of the major arterial routes out of Wales. The cattle coming out of the rich lands of Cardiganshire would come over the hill from Tregaron, cross the Wye at Newbridge, cross the Eithon, up through Dysyth, and up the quite steep slope behind us. And then eventually, I'm not quite sure when, but middle of the 1600s probably, maybe a little bit later, this enclosure behind me was built. And it was built probably as an overnight stop. It's really got all the hallmarks of a corral. It's got water, where those willows are, it's quite a nice pool there. And remember, the drovers didn't only drive cattle out of Wales, they drove geese. So it was important on your overnight stop that you had water. And it took 13 days apparently to come out of Cardigan and get to where eventually they went to the Great Market of Smithfield in London. Droving is a hugely important part of Welsh culture. It's locked up in the Welsh culture, it's locked up in folklore, it's locked up in economics. I mean, the first bank, the Black Ox in Llandovery, came out of droving, where local businessmen and traders in London would trust the drovers to transport large amounts of money because they moved in big packs. And although they were subjected to all sorts of banditry on the way and rustling, by and large they were a safe posse of people going through the countryside. And when we look at walls, hedges, banks and ditches, they're telling us that that enclosure was important. It was built, the walls or the hedges and the ditches and banks were put there to keep stock out, or in this case, to keep them in overnight. Landscape history is about looking at landscape and looking at what influence man has had on that landscape and the why and the wherefore of that. And I hope by coming on the courses that people will get enthused, get an understanding of using maps, of looking at lumps and bumps in the landscape, and looking at the settlement places, looking at the field systems, and then be able to go back to their own homes and discover things that haven't yet been discovered.